Thank you, everyone, for joining us today on our video on building a robust business continuity and disaster recovery strategy. Today, I have Matt Cianfarani. I didn't even ask you how to pronounce your last name before we started doing this. Oh man, is it Cianfarani?
Yeah, no, that works. Technically, it's
Close enough.
close enough.
Go ahead and introduce yourself, Matt. Sorry.
Absolutely, nice to join you today. So, Matt Cianfarani, I'm a business development manager for Sherweb's continuity suite of products. I've been with the company for about 5 years, and I come from a technical background. I used to previously work within our network operations team.
Awesome, awesome. And as a starter question, pineapple, does it belong on a pizza or does it not?
So, I come from a very strict Italian heritage. I have to say no. I do. I think I'll get my dual citizenship revoked if I say yes to that.
Oh, I just wonder. I always start off with a question. The last video I did, I asked them like, does peanut butter go on the top slice of bread or the bottom slice of bread? And they were like, I
So,
never really
obviously,
thought about that. See, yeah, I always say the top, but you never know. Hey, some people think differently. But so today we're going to talk a little bit about Matt's specialty, which is talking about business continuity, disaster recovery, and solutions around that. So Matt, let's kick this off. So like we're talking about business continuity, disaster recovery, right? It's a fairly large topic to discuss, but like what's some if we're gonna talk around those technologies, around those strategies, like what's some key components of a good business continuity or disaster recovery plan or solution?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think that one of the most important things for partners to really think about is you have to have both, right? You can't just have backup and you can't just have disaster recovery. At the end of the day, these solutions usually offer more than one aspect of the portion of those, right? Some will do just straight backup, some will do just straight replication, which can be defined as disaster recovery. But you really need to find the proper medium between those two things and actually offer a backup and disaster recovery plan. One of the best examples already that I can think of is I actually have a family member, and I'm gonna call him out in a video here. I'm not gonna say his name, but his entire business hinges off of a server that he backs up offsite once per day. But sometimes he needs to reference things that have just been backed up very recently. He has no replication. That server lives under his desk, right? So if you don't have a proper strategy for actually restoring your data and then looking at how to restore in the event of an actual disaster, be it natural, physical, data driven. That's why you need both.
Yeah, that's part of the discussion MSPs have to have with their clients, right? So like, terms we always use on the technical side, right, not from our clients, but recovery point objective and recovery time objective, right? Like, how quickly do I need to be up and running before it's like detrimental to the business, and then how much data can we lose, right? Our recovery point objective, like, is it okay to lose one day of data, a week of data, et cetera, right? So like you're having those conversations with a client, maybe they've never had them before. Like, what's your tips and tricks on trying to get people to realize that like the balance right there, right? Because like we don't want you to lose any data, but you got to lose some data unless you have like a really high end, really expensive, really resource intensive process. But like, how do you balance that? How do you have that conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. I really encourage partners to try and figure out what the end customer's real requirement and need is. Not every company will have the exact same RPO and RTO tolerance, right? Some customers will be okay with having data take longer to restore or data not being backed up as frequently. So you have to have that conversation with the end client and the end user to really determine what their risk tolerance is. And once you understand the risk tolerance, then you can really start to put together an actual plan for them.
Yeah, so like identifying which services are critical, which is a really fun conversation to have. So like one of the things I used to do was I used to audit health systems and hospitals, and banks, and all the fun things. And I was talking with the hospital system one time, and we were going through like, what's the most important thing to you? And you would think it would be like medical records or like uh, uh, medicine charts and Mars and things like that, but it was really their billing system. And it's because like there's so much transactional stuff going on with like suppliers and supplies that are needed that like if the billing system went down for more than 3 days, like the hospital would have to go into like emergency recovery. Like they could live without an X-ray machine, but like if the billing system stopped, if they couldn't get money from insurance providers or Medicare, Medicaid, et cetera. So the really a wake up call to me is like what is most important to the business, because you can't just assume just because it's a certain business that their services that you would think they would need are critical or not, right? Because you don't think about things like payroll or other critical services. So like what's your tips on helping clients kind of dig in and or helping partners dig in and understand how do they have that conversation with them? Like how do they understand what services are critical?
Sure, absolutely. And I'm going to ask the question: Have you ever seen how the Blue Angels practice for an air show? I know that's a random comment, but what they
No.
do is they actually walk through their routine before they fly it, and they visualize it. So having a conversation, asking the client to sit down and say, "Disaster strikes today. All your systems are offline. Walk me through your day-to-day operations and actually tell me what you'd be accessing first. What would you be the most impacted by not actually having?" So having them walk through their disaster will help them discover, well, maybe we didn't really think that this one server that helps us print invoices would be more important than another system doing another specific task. So by sitting there and walking through that, it's a fun little exercise. You can actually turn it into a small little game. Really kind of helps with that business trust relationship too. But have them just walk through their day to day and help them determine and discover what is the most critical to them.
Yeah. Yeah. We started getting like tabletop exercises and things where we mostly think about it from a cybersecurity perspective, right? Like running through business email compromises. But the same thing can be done with like business continuity, disaster recovery. It's like, let's run through this exercise if a critical system goes down or a vendor becomes inaccessible, right? Like when you're dealing with like platform outages or service outages, right? Then how do we pivot from that, right?
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. And you'll notice as well that when, because you mentioned that you do tabletop exercises for security and continuity, but also in daily practice, right? These tabletop exercises can expose a lot about the end clients, and I do encourage all partners to run through all aspects, maybe even their day to day with no disaster.
Yeah, that's I've been through so many of those tabletop exercises, and they're always like, if you throw certain injects or different pieces to it, like you start to learn a little bit about the way that the people think or that they don't think or the things you didn't think about, right? Like again, one of the ones we found out is like if we do a tabletop exercise with a client and we were like, all right, like your billing systems, I mean, your payroll systems are down as part of this. And they were like, well, payroll goes out at the, mid month and end of month or something to that effect. And they're like, what happens if we don't pay our employees because their payroll system's down? Like, what's the detriment of that? Do you start shedding employees? Do you get, well, how does all that work? So like walking them through all the different scenarios so you can better identify either redundancies that you can put in place or again, like how do you prioritize certain services? Which kind of, we're kind of touching on the next topic I wanted to cover, which is like we all start somewhere, but we all start small. Like I remember for our MSP, we started off with just like a basic backup service, right? Like, all right, the files are being backed up. But then the next piece was like, all right, so how do we test recovery? And then how do we build redundancy in the services? And how do we build more uptime using, Azure or some kind of, virtual platforms where I can spin up services? But like you have to start somewhere. So like how do you build on the practice from the basics, right? Like so what's your advice for that?
Yeah, absolutely. So once you've identified what your backup solution is going to be, getting everything backed up, that's the bare minimum, right?
Yeah.
And once you have that data going somewhere, hopefully not to a server sitting in the closet in your office, but hopefully somewhere that's actually protected and compliant with the rules, you have to just look at what the next step to build out upon there is. Do you need offsite backup? Do you need to replicate between your offsite backup and move it from one data location to the other? Some don't, right? Some clients, they don't need that type of replication on the back end, but some do. And there are actually some compliances that will require that. But then you have to go into the actual, I'm going to call it the exercise of how are we going to recover if everything is down type of thing, right? So sure, you have your data backed up. That's great. You can restore it. Restorations take time, as you mentioned with the RPOs and the RTOs. So then do you need to look at replication, maybe live replication with some type of an automated failover? So it's a building block approach, right? You always want to start in the bottom by getting everything backed up. Then from there, you need to identify what the next level of your backup is, things like replication, and then what is going to be mission critical and may need to be replicated, put into a DR environment. Keep on building up there from the base of the backup.
Yeah. Yeah. It includes cloud services too, right? So when we start talking about
It
cloud
does.
services, we tend to think, well, let's take Microsoft for example. They're the big guys on the block, right? Like, oh, they'll have backups in case something bad happens, but it's not always the case, right?
Very much isn't the case, right? I mean, we don't necessarily assume that Microsoft is going to just have servers turn off in the middle of the day, but outages happen. But you also need to protect against your internal threat too. And the internal threat may not be the right word, but I'm going to say internal risk. The user that deleted something they really, really need, right? So you have to make sure that you're looking at everything holistically.
Yeah, yeah. So we always call them threats on my side of the world, the security side. It's either non-malicious insider threats or malicious insider threats. Like non-malicious are the people who just accidentally delete stuff. We always
Yeah.
we always call them maybe not to their face, Matt, but we do call them threats sometimes.
No, it's just a non-malicious insider threat. I'll use that. It sounds a little less intimidating.
Oh yeah, for sure, for sure. So sorry, so we have our plan in place, and we have our solution, right? It's a fully robust solution that gives us all the bells and whistles we're ever going to need. But how do we how do we get those solutions in place at our clients, right? So when we talk about either the discussion around putting those services in place, like how do we sell it, right? Do you have some pointers on how do we help push our clients in the direction of doing better backups, better recovery?
Sure, absolutely. I always prefer to try and educate clients versus threaten clients. And threaten is a very strong word, but sometimes you'll say if you don't do X, you're going to have Y happen when a big bad outage happens, or you're opening a huge can of worms of risk by not including a geo replication into your backup. You don't want to use intimidating language. I find you have to educate the end users. You have to describe to them, and you say you're currently protected for this, but we can also protect you from this and offer you this. So it becomes a really kind of educational selling thing. And you really want to make sure your partners, your customers and yourselves are building trust, right? When you're talking to them and you're telling them what could happen in an educative way, instead of just telling them everything might fall down one day, you're building that trust with that customer. And that really helps them take what you're seeing and look at actually implementing a solution, of which there are many on the market.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And as part of this process, right? You're hoping you never have to use them. You're hoping that everything's smooth sailing. Eventually, though, there will come times where it tests your ability to restore data. So the bad thing happens, right? No matter what it is,
Mhm.
ransomware, outage, dead equipment, etc. What's your tips on recovery? What do we do? What do we do first?
Sure. So first of all, always test your recovery, right? That's part of the trust building exercise. But routine recovery tests, replication tests, DR tests, and failover tests are vital. And as I mentioned, that's what's going to allow your end user to really trust you. But let's just say it is that really bad day. Something has fallen over, and now you're in a situation where you need to recover from an outage or an incident. You have to look at things in order of priority. So the priority servers that you cannot deal without, the priority systems, workloads, whatever they are, have to be recovered and restored first. You also have to look at where you're recovering them to. In the event of a physical disaster, a flood, fire, you may not be able to go straight back to the existing environment that it was on. So you need to keep that into account when you're building out your strategy of where will the workloads reside during an issue.
Yeah, and even as important is like how do we access it when something bad happens, right? Because we dealt with an issue a few years back at our MSP where um client burned like to the ground, right? Like they had a it was a there was around there was a wedding that was going on near them. They were shooting fireworks at the wedding, and one of the fireworks landed on their like front porch of their business and caught the whole building on fire, burned like. So you have to then figure out like you don't even have a place to work at this point. Like, how do we get those critical services up? But then, secondly, like, how do they access them? So you start talking about like VPNs, almost to the point where we were building like RDP servers in these virtual clouds so that people could access their services. But like, if you don't think about it ahead of time, you always think about, like, I can restore a server and it's spun up in the cloud and it's fine. But then, like, the second party is like, how do we access those services? Like access is just as important as availability, I think in that instance.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that that really should also be part of your walkthrough and testing phase, right? So you've done your walkthrough, everything's down. Well, let's redo this walkthrough where you physically can't do it in this location, you're doing it somewhere else. A lot of the solutions that are on the market now do allow you as well to pre-configure some networking aspects, some tunnels, some VPN clients, make sure everything is ready to roll in the event of an issue. And I really encourage customers to put that into the full testing stage, right? Maybe have some key stakeholders or IT people actually go home and try and access the system from a third party device, or a laptop or whatever it is, to make sure that they're able to do so.
Yeah, for sure. Like you got to be able to test, and like I think it's like so. It makes it a little bit more complex with remote workers too, right? Trying to get them all wrangled in and figured out. But like I think as part of that process too, of like remote workforce, you add the ability to work with like the ability to access services remotely through different devices. So I think like there's a give and take with remote workforce as well with it as well. Last question before we go. Hopefully it's not too much difficulty. So when we're planning, so we've done our plan, right? We've handed off a plan to the client. How often do we go back and reassess that plan, right? Because things change, business outcomes change, business divisions change, technology changes, right? Like how often do you feel we should go back and reevaluate those plans?
I would say often, and by often, it really will depend on the end client. But if you have a customer that is really at a high growth phase, they're implementing things all the time. Maybe do that quarterly or even more frequently, right? If the customer doesn't change anything, they're still using the same legacy system from years ago. You can do that yearly, but you really have to sit down with them and say, in the last 12 months, what have we implemented, right? And since we last spoke, what has changed? Have you hired any additional people that are working remote? Have you opened a new office that we might have to pre-configure a tunnel to get into? Right. So you have to have those rediscovery conversations quite often, and then adjust the implementation plan for DR as often as you possibly can.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Yeah, I used to always tell people it's like at the end of a project, like we had a major project like an email migration or a migration from on-prem file services like Azure Files or SharePoint or something. It's like as part of that project, right? As part of your, when you're building out that solution, part of it should be a discussion on how do we recover those services as well, right? Because a lot of times we'll implement it and then the recovery talk comes after the fact, right? Way after the fact, instead of being as a part of that discussion. So
Yeah, no, you have to look at it again. You have to position everything properly. As I mentioned before, in building block approach is starting with backup. Never just start with backup. Implement backup first. Get stuff backed up, right? But then work on implementing everything else. You have to make sure that everything is always done properly from I'd say A to Z across the suite there. But never just assume anyone's okay with one thing without talking about the other.
yeah, for sure, sure. All right. This is my last fun question for you, Matt. If being that you work with a bunch of partners across the board, different business models, different ideas around backups, I guess. You had one wish and it could get rid of one bad practice in the space, what would that practice be?
Sure. I'm going to say only storing data on-prem. That's a bad practice that happens so many times. And I get sometimes it's a cost-driven factor as well. You have a nice storage server you've purchased a few years ago. You want to keep using it. You want to get your money out of that. But then you have a physical disaster or a disaster with the technology on that box. Drives fail, RAID arrays fail, things fail. Never assume that storing any data locally is good enough.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many times I'd walk into new clients and they're like, "Yeah, we back up." They'd point to like a USB drive plugged into the server, and I just feel like, "Gosh, like it'll be function. It's probably served you good in the past, but we gotta do some upgrades here." That's going back to the discussion around the client that burned down. That was their backup solution. We onboarded them, and then 3 months later, their building caught on fire. But luckily, we were able to get all their stuff off site. Uh, the fun part was part of our original discussion was with them was like, "Hey, you should probably start scanning in some of these documents," because they had boxes and boxes of files, and we are like, "You should probably digitize some of this, and like we could just put it in some cold storage. You never have to worry about it again." and like they had about 20% of their files digitized by the time they burned down. They lost 80% of their paper files. So like a real good classic case. I think I wrote a white paper for the backup company on that about like, hey, here's why it's important to make sure you have offsite backups and the ability to restore, because that those on-prem USB drives do burn up a lot of times in a fire.
Well, and there are sometimes compliance requirements to keep those copies of files. If you can't keep them now because they've quite literally gone up in smoke, well, that's another risk to talk about.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Like we even start getting on the compliance side of things. Like if you lose like let's say HIPAA, you lose access to medical records, right? Like that's a huge violation there.
Oh, absolutely.
That's a whole discussion right around compliance and backups and finding vendors that meet your requirements around data protections and safety, because that's the thing that's part of your due diligence, right? When you're picking a backup vendor, is like understanding how do they protect your backups, especially if they're hosting them offsite.
Yeah, no, exactly. And every vendor is different, right? There are some out there that are completely storage agnostic and you can use whoever you need. So then you might be introducing complexity by bringing in a new storage vendor that you have to now vet for compliance. So it's a huge ecosystem, and a lot goes through the selection of a vendor process, which is one of the best conversations I have with customers, is talking to them and trying to find the proper fit for them.
Yeah. Well, Matt, I appreciate you. One last thing before we go. If someone wants to get in touch with you, learn more about backup solutions, or pick your brain or whatever, how do they find you?
Yeah, absolutely. You can send me a message on LinkedIn. I think, Roy, you can probably put a link to that somewhere on here as well, but reach out. Happy to have a conversation at any time.
Again, Matt, thank you. Appreciate you. Anything I can do to help you, let me know.
Perfect. Thank you so
All right.
much.
Thanks, Matt. Have a good one.
Take care.